Well, I actually grew up as a child in a very industrialized, very crowded city, and it was even as a young boy, it was clear that the environment uh, exposed us to a lot of things. There was smoke from incinerators and burning, major industrial facilities, railroads that burned diesel fuel and had smoky engines and so even as a young boy, I was aware of the environment. Um, my interest was even made greater when we realized that I was born with a congenital heart defect, a hole in my heart. Um, and no one else in the family, it wasn't inherited. It was always a mystery to me and my doctors why I had a heart defect. Luckily, it was repaired when I was a boy at Johns Hopkins. But later on, during my graduate studies, I learned that my area uh, of the US, of New Jersey, had the highest rates of cancer deaths in the entire nation. And that really piqued my interest in understanding how the environment, how exposures in our environment might be related to cancer and other health effects. And so I devoted my life really to understanding the relationship between our health and our environment. Well, environmental epidemiology is all about studying how the environment and exposures in the environment affect our health. And it is essential that we are able to understand who's exposed, what level they're exposed, how long they're exposed, and who's not exposed, so that we can compare rates of disease or adverse effects in the exposed people versus non-exposed. Similarly, it's important to understand if there are cases of disease to be able to understand, say, suppose I want to study leukemia in a community. Um, it's important to understand the levels of exposure in that community and answer the question, were the people who developed disease more highly exposed than those who did not develop the disease? So the basic methods of environmental epidemiology depend upon our ability to understand who's exposed and who's not exposed and compare the risks in those two populations. It's absolutely core to have good exposure assessment. And in fact, in many epidemiology studies, we don't have measures of individual exposure. And it's the weakest link in really the study of epidemiology, characterizing exposures so we can understand that relationship to health. Without exposure data, it's impossible to do effective environmental epidemiology. That is such an important and such a difficult question. The environment is very complex, and unlike animal studies, where we can very much control the exposures of say a rodent study and dose the animals and see how their health is affected by different levels of exposure. Uh, Human populations, communities are exposed to thousands of chemicals. They also have other things that affect their health, their behavior. Do they smoke? How is their diet? Their heredity or their biology? Uh, how do genetics affect the development of disease? And so environmental epidemiology is very complex, particularly if we only study one substance at a time. So it's important that the science evolve and that we understand it's really important to understand the full total exposure of a population. For instance, if we only study one compound, say ethylene oxide, or or perhaps a disinfection byproduct in the drinking water like chloroform, you have to understand that the community exposed is exposed to many other things. And so how do we account for that? Well, we need to consider that. We need to consider the social factors as well as other chemical risk factors, and it makes it very, very difficult. I think the field is becoming much more sophisticated. We can measure things much better now, and we're able to understand multiple compounds and exposures. That's going to be important. That might contribute to health effects. We're able to understand multiple pathways of exposure. So it's important that we look at exposure as a system and not just one thing like air pollution, but we have to think about the indoor environment. We have to think about food. We have to think about all the possible pathways of exposure. And this makes it very challenging, but also we are getting better at that to understand how those total exposures might contribute to health. We have a lot of work to do. It's an exciting field, but we are understanding that. And I think the field will really continue to grow dramatically as the science evolves. Okay. Well, well, first of all, this is a field that involves many different disciplines: epidemiologists, chemists, engineers, meteorologists. Many, many disciplines go into understanding exposure, and also the risk sciences, those who do risk assessment. So it's very essential to many scientific disciplines. It's essential to regulation and really essential to public health so that our public health leaders can make good decisions about keeping our food safe, our water safe, our air safe, and our population health safe. So it is incredibly rewarding to contribute to public health in a way that you can also do research and discover. And in the recent meeting of the International Society of Exposure Science, you saw hundreds of researchers from all around the world who are developing new technologies to measure individual exposures, new technologies to improve the way we monitor air and water and food, and how we improve our understanding of the health effects of those exposures. It's an incredibly exciting field, and I think it will continue to grow. It's necessary for industry to understand the safety of their products. It's necessary for governments to effectively preserve the sustainability of industry and the protection of public health. And the scientific community is, I think, enthusiastically involved because it contributes to so much of our understanding of engineering to control environmental exposures, of the risk sciences to understand health effects. So the key is really having good mentoring, good societies, and really essentially support for the research. Now, what do I mean by support? Well, it's important. Researchers can't be enthused if there's no funding to conduct research. So I think if we want to continue to move forward, and it is very important that we move this field forward, that we have to maintain levels of support for the research because developing of new technology takes resources. Secondly, you have to understand that there are some interests that don't want exposures to be measured. And so, for instance, industry may not be too happy if researchers go to a community on the fence line of an industry and begin to measure the emissions from that facility. So they might push political decision makers to not fund this kind of research. So there will always be a bit of a joust between the public health community and the polluters, about whether it's appropriate to do exposure related research. But I think in the long run, our desire to protect public health, to respond to emergencies, and to prevent new exposures that affect our health, there will be long-standing support for exposure science and opportunity for people to make it a very rewarding career. It's very exciting to have your research contribute to the protection of public health of your community or the broader global community by understanding how things might be prevented or how exposures can be reduced. It is a hot topic, and I think it will be a tremendous help and improvement to exposure science because exposure science collects so many samples. Um, there's so much data on the output from the chemical analysis. There are issues of understanding the time of exposure, the location of exposure, and big data and artificial intelligence methods will allow us to pull together data from literally thousands of sources and different types of data and make it more understandable to ask the questions about who is most at risk, where do we find the highest exposures, how do we address time and time of exposure, and how might this be related to risk. So there are many, many questions that artificial intelligence and big data analysis will help us with. I am hoping that we will develop international data sets so that we can learn around the globe from one another about environmental transport, about who's exposed, and also importantly, how to prevent exposure. So I see, just as we see the advancement of artificial intelligence in medicine in diagnosing human health issues, artificial intelligence will allow us to fully use the data sets of exposure science, combine them, and really understand how we may most effectively reduce exposures and protect public health. There are so many challenges. Exposure science is really a new science. It came from our understanding of workers becoming ill from high level exposures and the field of industrial hygiene, but really exposure science has taken off as a field and grown rapidly really since the 1990s. So in the past 30 years, we have seen a revolution in detection technology, in measurement methods, in mobile monitoring, in personal monitoring, and in the interpretation of data. So I think there are still many, many challenges. For the most part, exposure is the missing link in our risk assessments. And so the field has tremendous challenges. And in the written responses, I wrote a pretty long list of things, but let me talk about them. Well, first of all, the biggest challenge is how do we account for many, many exposures that are happening at the same time to our populations or communities? How do we measure cumulative exposures? This will involve measuring the many, many mixtures, the many, many compounds and types of exposures, whether they be through food or water or air, that we're exposed to. Here's where artificial intelligence will help us understand that data. But it's a tremendous challenge to understand the complex mixtures that the human population is exposed to. We also need, I think, for prevention to not look at a pollutant or a chemical at one place. Say, for instance, oh, we have a water pollutant here, but and so how do we set a standard for the pollutant in water? If you look at our challenge with some of the Teflon-related compounds or the PFAS compounds, the fluorinated compounds, now we realize they're spread throughout the environment in every part of the earth. and in our food and water, and they're in our bodies. And so we have to think of a different way to see these chemicals. And I call it developing a new lens, a systems approach, so that when a chemical is introduced to the marketplace, we have a greater understanding of the many, many pathways where people might be exposed, a systems lens. Similarly, when we develop environmental epidemiology and or other studies to measure community exposure, we have to look at the big picture and understand all of the pathways of exposure, including inside the home. That is the missing link in exposure. We also have to use our data better. There's so much data around the world that has been collected on exposure that it's overwhelming. We need to have big data tools, artificial intelligence tools, and perhaps an international dashboard that will allow us to access, to learn from one another, and to improve our scientific studies and our applications of the data. We have to realize that there are many, many disciplines that go into exposure science. So I didn't go to school for exposure science. I did study industrial hygiene and measurements, but I'm an epidemiologist. I'm a risk assessor. We need to have people from the worlds of toxicology and medicine and epidemiology and chemistry and engineering working across the disciplines as new products are developed to test them, to understand their pathways in the environment. And for pollutants that we already have as major problems, we need to be able to understand how to measure them, but also how to explain and assess the risks that are related to those exposures. So we have to see exposure science through a systems lens and through a cross-disciplinary approach that will bring together really all the talents and all the different disciplines that we need. Also, I think we need to rediscover occupational exposures, particularly in the US. We have really decreased the number of epidemiology studies that we do in the workplace to understand health effects to our workers who are exposed at the highest doses. I would like to see a revitalization of occupational epidemiology and measurements in the workplace. And and also we need to really develop new ways to understand how the climate may lead to new exposures, whether it be wildfires or catastrophic events that lead to industrial releases or other mixtures. There's a changing world and it's changing our environmental exposures. And so we need to understand the very complicated context of exposures and how they may affect our health. And finally, we need to communicate better. Many scientists are fantastic at the measurements of concentrations of a contaminant, say in soil or food. But what does that mean to the average person? I think individual communities need to have tools so that they can understand their potential exposures and take measures to reduce them. Regulation is not the solution to everything in environmental exposures. And so there are things that people could do to reduce their risks if it was more understandable how they may be exposed to contaminants in their environment. And so communication, risk communication, more effective translation of the science is a responsibility for exposure scientists for the future. Well, I think there's so much work to do, as I mentioned in some of my other answers, but I think if you think about everyday life and how we live and might be exposed to things in our environment, um, the biggest missing link is how in our indoor environment we might be exposed to things that affect our health. And so I think we need research to really fill in the information gaps on the indoor environment. Our environmental regulations have monitored the outdoor air and the drinking water, but we know very little about our indoor environments. Um, and I think there are ways to greatly improve health by improving um, the quality of indoor air and protecting the indoor environment from contamination. So indoor monitoring is very important. I think there are many things that we're now understanding are uh, very important exposures, like exposures we all have related to the incredible increase in the use of plastics in our environment, in our food wrapping, um, and now understanding that microplastics are inside of our body, even inside the major organs of the human body. And so understanding exposures related to plastics from a global perspective and an individual perspective are very important. I think we need to better protect people who live on the fence line of major industries. Usually, these are people who are poor or unable to really move away from contamination, and they are our most vulnerable. And so we need to have the right kind of tools to monitor, measure, and prevent exposures for those who really are right on the fence line of contamination. And also, one thing that has not developed too much, but has been very effective for control of pollutants like lead and mercury, is we need biomonitoring, measurements of contaminants in the human body, in blood, in urine, so that we can actually understand individual exposure levels, understand who's at highest risk of exposure, and therefore at highest risks of adverse effects. Uh, so biomonitoring the combination of using biological measurements of individuals along with environmental monitoring will really let us understand the full life cycle of exposure and the actual individual exposure levels. Biomonitoring will be very important to the future. And then finally, um, I mentioned the environment is changing. We have to understand how this changing environment, whether it be new ways to generate electricity, the transition of our energy methods, um, or the occurrence of catastrophic climate-related events might affect exposures, or even the perhaps more simple but worrisome aspect of how increasing global temperatures might increase the use of pesticides, for instance, or the levels of pollutants in our air, how climate change, how a changing climate affects our exposures. And then one more thing, we need to communicate this science better. Scientists need to do a better job explaining their work, putting it in perspectives for the average person who's not a scientist, and explaining the relationship between exposure and human health better. Now, in terms of how you get better um, or improve the reach of the journal and how you get the best scientists to publish in the journal, I think it's important to be part of our international societies, starting with ISIS. The ISES annual meeting was fantastic and and a great place um, to meet the not only the very well established leaders in exposure science, but also um, the up and coming, the rising stars, the students who are really excited about the changes in this field. I think it's important to be part of societies like ISIS, but I also think it's important to recognize that there are many disciplines that depend upon exposure science. So the field of epidemiology, the field of risk assessment and the risk sciences, the field of risk communication, and even from a social perspective, the policy studies that use exposure data to set standards and are challenged by protecting our environment and our food through the regulatory or policy process, these are all fields that the journal should reach out to make sure that the journal as well has a systems look and includes the many, many disciplines of exposure science and the many, many challenges of the social interaction with exposure and the communication of risk related to exposures.